Welcome back to our classroom. Today we have Julio Anta, the writer of many graphic novels, including the Eisner-nominated Frontera, This Land is Our Land, A Blue Beetle Story, Home, and Si Se Puede, the Latino heroes who changed the United States. Yes, indeed, folks. And Julio and I were recently on a panel together, and I got to hear him firsthand share his insight, and I was really inspired. I want to write a graphic novel. I wanted to before, but after listening to Julio and digging into some of his work, I'm even more excited to write a graphic novel. And today we're joined by Junior Han. And Junior is a senior at Lowell High School in Massachusetts who is also working on a graphic novel. And this is a new exploration for him, new idea. He's entering new territory. And so I said, you know what, man, this is a great opportunity to do something together, to co-host this episode, to welcome student voice. And we want to represent that and be collaborative in that sense and model that. And so, Junior, thank you for being here. And Julio, thank you for being here.
Roberto, thank you for having me. I'm super excited. It was great to meet you at NCTE, and I'm super excited to chat with you and Junior.
Junior, glad that you're here. How you feeling?
Thank you. I'm excited to be a part of this today.
Yes, well, thank you for taking your time to join us. Let's go ahead and dig right in because I know you have several questions lined up, Junior, and I have a number of things I want to ask because it's going to help me in my development. I come into this as a learner, and so uh, Julio, graphic novels, right? We know it's a powerful medium
Mhm.
for engaging reluctant readers. And it seems that in the past several years, they're like really taking off. Like people are truly resourcing to graphic novels as an instructional tool. And so, what strategies or approaches would you recommend to teachers who want to introduce graphic novels as a tool for literacy development?
Yeah, so just to piggyback off of what you were saying initially, graphic novels are the fastest growing sector of publishing right now. And graphic novels for middle grade, which is middle school age, and young adults, are the fastest growing areas. And it's not, it might be surprising to some people, but it's not superhero comics. This is oftentimes people telling their own stories, using their own experiences, and telling coming of age stories and stories that have social impact to them. And that's the work that I've dedicated myself to. Before we started recording, Junior was telling me that he read Home, which does involve superpowered people, but through the lens of, separating families at the border in 2018. And what I think is so powerful about graphic novels is that it allows readers to contextualize so much better, so much easier than traditional prose novels, I think. In my book Frontera, it takes place in the Sonoran Desert. If this was a prose novel where I'm describing everything that happens, it's possible that a reader might be confused and picture this boy Mateo who's crossing the Sonoran Desert as if he was crossing the Sahara Desert or some other, more well-known desert. When in reality, the Sonoran Desert is so alive with wildlife and plants. It's this beautiful, diverse place. And the same when he meets an indigenous character who is native to the land of the Sonoran Desert. This woman named Darcy who has seen the border cross her back when that land was part of Mexico and then the U.S. and of course before that indigenous land. And we can show all those things in a graphic novel and make it crystal clear to readers and to educators as to what is going on. And I think there's also a big rise in educator guides when it comes to graphic novels, which I'm very proud that all of my books have educator guides. And they allow, teachers and instructors to really dive into the themes that are present in graphic novels and also get into the literacy of graphic novels and understand how they work. So for me, I think they're extremely powerful.
Absolutely. Junior, you want to build on that, especially since you just read Home and finished it last night?
Home, I feel like in Home, the story about the Mexicans, like the immigrants and the United States Army, they was trying to they did not like the Mexican immigrants. They was kicking them out. They was taking them out of everything. but they fought back and they discovered their own powers.
And what are some things that surfaced for you as you were reading that, or even some questions that you have for Julio as an author, as a writer, and that might support your development as a writer?
Um, I would like to know, like, if you have an illustrator, um, like, do you give them ideas or do you let him or her come up with a vision based on your words?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I do work with illustrators because you wouldn't want to see a graphic novel drawn by me. It's not good. I started when I was a kid drawing comics, and that was my first like introduction into creative work was making these little comics with my brother. But yeah, I do work with illustrators. There's this core group of illustrators that I like to work with a lot, and I do a lot of work with. But generally, the way that it works is I write a script, sort of like a screenplay for a movie, which does describe what is happening, and I break it down into pages and panels. So, for example, the first page of Home has three panels. So I would write page one, three panels, panel one, and I sort of paint a picture with words of what you should see in that panel. So it might be Juan and his mother are walking alongside train tracks, and behind them is a caravan of migrants who are all following. And it could be that I can describe that their clothes are maybe dirty to indicate a long journey that they've been on. They have big backpacks. And then the artist will draw it. And then I'll also indicate what the words are, right? Like if I have a narration or if I have dialogue between characters, because that's also really important for an illustrator to know because they have to make sure to leave enough room for the text. So oftentimes when I write, I'm very visual. I can picture every single panel that I'm describing in my head. But when you're working with a really great artist, it'll be totally different than what you imagined and so much better because that's their specialty, right? My specialty is writing and their specialty is illustrating. And when those two things come together, it's what makes, the beautiful collaboration of what a comic or a graphic novel can be.
All right.
And and your storytelling, it combines, and we see this not just through the illustration, but certainly through the words, how it combines historical, cultural, and social themes.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering, how can graphic novels serve as entry points for teaching complex topics like immigration, activism, or identity in a way that resonates with students? And Junior started speaking about this when he talked about home and some of the things that he
Hmm.
extracted from the message that was being conveyed. But I'm wondering, yeah, how can we leverage that to really continue to dig into these complex topics that are impacting our society? I mean, you mentioned that you wrote that in 2018, but here we are in 2024,
Yeah.
still relevant.
Yeah, I think and I'll say this about all media, film, TV, prose, graphic novels. All media really gives us a window into lives that maybe we normally don't interact with, right? Identities that are not our own, experiences that are not our own. And I often say that I think, unfortunately, one of the flaws in humanity is that it's very hard for us to see other perspectives unless we meet people of those perspectives or we interact with them in some way. And I think that's what's beautiful about media is that it brings us into these new worlds. And particularly graphic novels, when you compare them to prose novels, sort of to my point earlier, which is that it allows for more nuance and no confusion, right? And when a character like Juan, who's the main character in Home, when we see his face start changing over a series of panels after he's ripped out of his mother's arms and they're being separated
Mhm.
by the government. You can describe that with words in a prose novel, right? You can use all sorts of descriptive language, but there's nothing like seeing that face and seeing it change and the desperation and the transition into anger and confusion. And that's something that we can do in graphic novels that is unique to other published work. So, I think you can also add other pieces of context when it comes to culture. I mentioned the first scene in Home where you see that they have big backpacks, they have water jugs, they have all these things that you can see that indicate a further cultural context to what's going on. And I think that's so powerful, and those are things that you can see in film and TV, but when it comes to written word, I think graphic novels really excel in that.
Yeah, and I appreciate about graphic novels is that it allows for multimodal learning, right? There's some folks who can certainly process words well, but there are others who learn well through visuals. And so there's an opportunity to merge both. Junior, you had another really question that you ran by me earlier. I'd love for you to share that now with Julio.
I would like to know, where do you get your story ideas or inspiration for your books?
Yeah, I mean, ideas come from all over the place. For most of my books, I can pinpoint where a lot of them started. With Home, it started from, you know, at the time during the 2018 family separation crisis, I had a 3-year-old son. Now he's 10 years old. And, my family background is my father came to the US from Cuba when he was 5 years old. He was welcomed with open arms. He didn't have to worry about any sort of immigration status because he was coming from Cuba, and Cuba at the time had a very privileged immigration policy with the US. On the other hand, my mother, she was born here, but her parents were from Colombia and they were undocumented immigrants in the US for many years, for almost 2 decades. And they spent my whole mother's childhood really going from place to place anytime there was a rumor of immigration, of INS coming to, raid my grandmother's hotel that she worked at or a motel that they were staying at. So within those two contexts of my family story, I was watching the 2018 family separation crisis play out while also being a new father and asking myself, what would I do if I was one of these people? I was seeing my son, my father in the eyes of these children that are being ripped away from their parents and put in cages and warehoused along the southern border. So that book came from a lot of anger, from a lot of distress in what was happening to this country. Um, and then Frontera was my next book, and that one came from wanting to understand what was the history of migration in the US, right? I knew little bits. I started doing research, and that's where I learned about the Bracero program, which was, during World War II when US men were being sent off to fight in Europe and in Asia. There were tons of factories in the US that now didn't have workers. And what did the US do? They, struck a deal with Mexico to allow Mexican workers to come to the US, take the jobs that were now left open in farms and in factories. And then when the war was over, some of these men that had been here for 10 years, some of them building lives, getting married, having children, building families in the US, were then deported right back to Mexico when they weren't needed anymore. And that was how I learned about, the way that, even though it might have been shocking what we were seeing during the Trump administration, that there was a legacy of violence when it came to immigrants. And so every book comes from the real world for me, but they come from different places. I have a book that's coming out in March called Speak Up Santiago. It's my middle grade debut. And this is a book about a child that feels a lot of anxiety and struggles with speaking Spanish. And that's something that, even though Spanish was my first language, it's something that I certainly dealt with as I was growing up and English was becoming, my dominant language. And now having a son who also struggles with Spanish, all of my books come from some part of me and some curiosity with the real world, but also from trying to fill a gap because all of my books are books that I think are missing in the canon of children's literature, in the market, or whatever you want to call it. They're all books that don't exist yet and that I wish existed. And that's where I create from. So to answer your question with a very long answer and now a short part, comes from all over the place, from all sorts of inspirations.
All right, all right.
That's
Um,
good. Sorry, go ahead, Junior.
I want to know, why did you decide that you wanted to write graphic novels?
I've been a fan of comics since I was a kid. I remember going to the drugstore. I grew up in Miami, Eckerd Drugs was like the big drugstore chain there at the time. Doesn't exist anymore, but they had a spinner rack, like a little spinning
Yeah,
rack with comics. And that was where I first got introduced to comics. I was reading Archie and Sonic the Hedgehog, like these things that were familiar to me, especially Sonic. And then eventually I got into manga and anime and other like superhero comics. Um, and I think, like a lot of people who read comics, and maybe this is the journey that you're going on right now also, you read comics, you love comics, and eventually you start wondering like, how hard can it be to write these things? Like I have stories, I have a voice. Maybe I should try to make my own comics. And it turns out it is really hard, but it is worth it, and the story of home, the family separation crisis, that's what inspired me to, as an adult, write my first comic because I was seeing what was happening and I felt like I wanted to contribute to that conversation. And also, it was almost like a form of therapy for me to really like write a scenario where the migrants that have no agency in real life, they don't have the power to change their situation when the government's tearing them apart from their families. I wanted to give them agency and give them a way to fight back. So yeah, it all just started from my love of reading comics and graphic novels.
Great question. I want to build on that. Well, particularly the notion of agency and fighting back. With the rise of book bans and challenges to certain types of literature, particularly those centering marginalized voices, what advice do you have for educators who want to advocate for graphic novels in their curriculum?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Because for me as a writer, it's really important for me not to self-censor myself. I think there's a tendency to do that in the times that we're living in now, where there's so many book bans. I've had conversations with fellow authors who have told me straight out that they have tried to tone down what they're writing so that they could sell it to publishers and that the publishers can market it and not have the fear of it being banned. Um, but I think in times like these, it's even more important to double down on what you believe and to have a strong point of view. So that's the author perspective. When it comes to talking to educators, I think what's important is to really highlight the historical importance in a lot of the topics that are being shared in these graphic novels. I think about my graphic novels, and I think about a book like Frontera, and this is US history, right? Whether we like it or not. But it also plugs into different subject matters, right? It's a book, and a book like Si Se Puede also, which is a nonfiction graphic novel about important Latinos throughout US history. It can be plugged into so many different subjects. You could use it in social studies, which I think is the most obvious way to talk about civic engagement, right? But you could also plug it into science when we're talking about Elena Ochoa, the first Latina to go to space, or Mario Molina, who was a chemist and discovered that the hole in the ozone layer was caused by humans. Um, I think what's important is to try to dig into these historically relevant topics and also to plug them into subjects that may not be obvious at first, but I think are relevant. So it's tough. I mean, I think unfortunately, this is a time where educators really have to advocate for the work that they're doing and even advocate to parents as to, the justification for why they're reading these texts. I don't think it should be like this, obviously, but I think it's important, and it's even more important than ever for educators to advocate on behalf of these books.
Well, we thank you for your boldness and for continuing to write and for doubling down. The stories that you're telling are vital and informative,
Thanks.
certainly. And I know, you're working on something that has not been shared yet, has not been published, that you give me the privilege to take a sneak peek at.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow, wow, wow. Powerful, man. Powerful.
Thank
I,
you.
I didn't, I, you know, I won't unpack it here because I know it's still in the works. But I want to just get to the point of how I was able to engage with your text and feel informed, but also look at things differently and expand my lens through the visuals and through the words. And it was clear that you did a lot of research with that work.
Hmm.
So I just felt it, it was a powerful experience for me to be able to engage with your graphic novels. And
Thank
so I
you.
want students to have that experience. I wasn't
Yeah.
reading stuff like that when I was in school. I don't remember
Same.
reading graphic novels at all, first of all,
Hmm.
in school, right? Yeah, I came across some comics and things of the sort, but I do not remember that being utilized as a tool to deepen our learning experience. And so I'm
Hmm.
like, man, this is awesome. Kids should be exposed to this, and it should be stuff that's truly going to help them to learn more about history and to feel that sense of like, oh wait, there's social impact here, and I have a responsibility. And so I want our young people to wrestle with that. Junior, I'll give you space to ask another question before we transition here.
All right. What was the first book you ever published, and how long did it take you to complete it?
Yeah, so Home was the first one. And that one's a little different than my others because it came out in single issue comics, kind of like the traditional comic book format of floppy issues. It came out in 5 issues. And it was my first graphic novel ever. I taught myself how to write graphic novels just to be able to make this book because of how passionate I
Wow.
was about this story, and for anyone else who wants to learn, I listen to a lot of like interviews with writers, all sorts of writers, not just comic book writers, because at the end of the day, story is story, no matter what, medium you're in. I read a book by Brian Michael Bendis, who's one of the big names in comics, called Words with Pictures, which really explains how to write for comics. He's the creator of Miles Morales. So he's if you're gonna listen to anyone, you should listen to him. But yeah, so it was a long journey, a longer journey than usual, to publish that book because first I had to teach myself how to write comics. Then I had to teach myself how to connect with publishers and get a publisher to publish your book, which is totally different form of creativity. I think it is still creativity because there's a hustle and there's a grind to it and there's a creativity of how am I going to build a relationship to get this in front of someone and then convince them that they should publish it. Um, and then it came out monthly for 5 months, one issue a month. And then it was collected into the graphic novel that you got to read. So I would say, family separation crisis happened in 2018. That was that was the inspiration. And then it came out in 2021. So that's 3 years for a 120 page graphic novel. 3 years is not abnormal, but like Frontera was 3 years from the time that we got a publisher to the time the book came out. But that was also a 250-page book. So it was significantly larger project. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think what matters more than like how long did it take is it something that you're passionate about? Is it something that if it comes out next month or if it comes out 5 years from now, is it something that you care about? And is it a story that you believe needs to be told? And that's the lens that I put all of my ideas through because I do tend to have a lot of ideas, and it's about sifting through which is the right one. And that's kind of the lens that I put it through. And I think that's the more important question to ask yourself when you're trying to make creative work.
Okay. Okay.
In Junior, in your case, you want to kind of condense what Julio laid out because, you're working on a particular assignment. It's not going to be 120 pages, although that could
Yeah.
be something that eventually happens over time.
Yeah.
And it's for you, what I extract from what Julio's saying is, study the people that are doing it, listen to what they're saying, use that as a model. And in your case, you end up laying out, you know, two, three, four, 5 pages, of solid work where, you're really telling your story. You're honing in on how you frame your words. You're thinking about how the illustration can complement your words. I think for you, that would be a huge win right now for the assignment that you're working on.
Yeah, and let me jump in for a second too, because I kind of skipped the part of my journey that is exactly what I think it exactly talks speaks to what you are doing, which is I had the idea for home, but I knew that I wasn't going to be able to convince a publisher to bet on me, who is no one in the industry at the time. So I started making mini comics first. And mini comics were these 4 to 10 page stories that tell a full and complete story. And that's really how I learned to write comics in writing these short stories, which I think is, it sounds like that's what you're going to do. And when I was writing those, I grew up watching shows like The Twilight Zone, which I loved, and are like these tight 22-minute stories that also have social impact a lot of times. So I just started rewatching a bunch of Twilight Zone episodes, and I started figuring out like, how do they tell a story so quickly and an impactful story? And then I started mimicking that with mini comics, which is, I'm going to write an 8 page story. So by the time I get to page two, I need to make sure that the character is on his journey already. We've set the table, we've set the stakes, and now he's going to do whatever he's supposed to do. And by page six, he's at that final battle that he needs to have to succeed in this story. And for me, that was a super effective way of like learning how to tell stories and do it in a short period of time that isn't, a huge time investment. So I think that's what I would do if I were you.
Okay.
That's solid advice. That's solid advice, Julio. Thanks for sharing that with Junior. I think it's what a wonderful experience for him to be able to tap into your expertise, your journey as he's thinking about writing and developing and studying graphic novels and centering the message that he's working on,
Mhm.
which is going to be powerful also. And uh, once he's done, would love to share with you what
Yeah, I'd
he
love to see
developed.
it.
For sure.
Well, Julio, I want to ask you as we start to wrap up this interview, what is your message of encouragement for the audience?
Yeah. Um, we're we've been living in a really tough time. And this isn't just, about who's president, about, I as people who are immigrants, as people who are family of immigrants, we are living in this legacy of anti-immigrant xenophobic sentiment being used as a ploy to further other people's motives. And I think it's important to rely on community in times like this to find your people, whether that's, a political home or just a community that you resonate and that you take care of each other. I think that's the most important thing during times like these. But then also, sort of what I mentioned earlier, and what I try to do with a lot of my work, which is look towards history, right? Um, history, there's a quote, I'm gonna butcher it, and I don't have the credit offhand, but it's that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
That's
And
good.
yeah, and I think, if you're listening to this, Google it, figure out who said it because they deserve the credit for it. But it is true, and I think when we look towards what has happened to immigrants in this country and what is about to start happening in, much higher frequency very soon, it does resemble a lot of what's happened. And I think we need to look towards communities and how they built solidarity with each other, how they fought back, and adapt that to, 2024 and what we're going through today in 2025 and every year after that. And I think it's also important to support art in these moments, and I'm not just saying that selfishly as someone who makes art, but that's where we get so much of our inspiration from, from books, from music, from movies. And it's more important than ever, I think, to support that and then take the inspiration that they provide and use it to move forward and support our communities.
Yeah. Awesome, awesome. Thanks for sharing. And apparently that was Mark Twain who shared
Okay.
the quote. I'm gonna remember that one.
Yeah.
So, if you had the opportunity to have lunch with anybody, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Oh man. You know, anyone that was in Si Se Puede for sure. Um, I think maybe because of the headspace that I've been in lately and the times that we're in, I'd love to sit down with Malcolm X, get some advice on the times that we're living in. He particularly re has resonated with me for so long, but I think especially in these moments that we're in now. But yeah, I think my book Si Se Puede is filled with people that I admire and that did important things. People like Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta. But yeah, I'd love to, hang out with Malcolm.
That's a great pick. That's a great
Yeah.
pick.
What about you? Who'd you choose?
Well, but before I get to it, Junior, I know Junior's eager to answer this question. As we
Cool.
talked about this a little bit at the beginning, he said he wanted to answer. So, Junior, if you had the opportunity to have lunch with anybody dead or alive, who would it be and why?
I'm not gonna lie. I would say Snoop Dogg. Snoop Dogg.
All right.
That's a
Uh,
first on our classroom, man. I haven't had Snoop as a pick yet. Tell me why Snoop.
Snoop, you see him on
'Cause
social
you
media.
young, man. You young. Like I'm.
He looks
yeah,
like a chill
is
around. He looks like he's fun to be around. He brings good vibes. He's always chilling,
okay.
having fun. That's what I
Yeah.
want to be around.
He'll give some great business advice. This is it's funny. I was actually talking to someone about Snoop Dogg the other day and how I feel, and I hope you tell me I'm wrong, but your generation might know him as just the guy that's in every commercial,
Uncle
and
Uncle
not
Snoop.
yeah, not the Snoop that, I grew up with.
Nah, I never seen him in no commercial before.
How are you now? I'm really interested. Like, how are you familiar with Snoop?
I mean, I used to listen to his music, yeah, before.
Oh, okay, through his music. Wow.
Good.
Wow. So fascinating because like a lot of the young people don't necessarily listen to the artists from that generation. Like a lot of the young people that I hear them when I hear them citing artists, well, oftentimes I don't even know who they're talking about.
New
Sometimes I
generation.
do, but Snoop, I wasn't ready for that, man. I'm not gonna lie. That was good.
It's a good answer.
That's good. My
How
answer
you?
to this question, let's see, on today, I think it's the same answer I've had on the last several times people have asked me. I would want to have lunch with my father, who passed away a couple years ago. Yeah, I'd want to, sit
Yeah.
down with him and have another moment and hear his voice. And he loved to eat at Olive Garden.
All
So
right.
I already know what we're gonna eat.
Yeah,
Yeah, love to have another moment there. So thank you both for sharing, man. It's
of
been a
course.
pleasure to have you, Julio, and learn so much. I'm interested to explore some of what you mentioned in terms of, hey, go listen to the creator of the Miles Morales series
Mhm.
to learn more and for me to also think about like, man, how can I capture history? How can we teach true history here through the use of this medium?
Mhm.
And even going back to listen to what you said and figuring out like, all right, hey, let me sit down with Junior. Junior, let's listen to Julio's advice a little more closely
Mhm.
and let's do some, step-by-step small actions to implement some stuff and that will help you develop 4 to 10 pages uh, of a mini story. So thank you for
Of
the
course.
insight. Thank you for offering Junior some tangible action steps. And overall, just want to thank you for your commitment to telling the stories that are on your heart, for following that passion, for telling stories about anxiety, which I think many people can relate to. And I think
Mhm.
our young people need to know that, hey, you're not alone in experiencing
Yeah.
anxiety, telling stories about immigration. My parents immigrated from the Dominican Republic. My wife immigrated from the Dominican Republic. You know, Lawrence, where I'm from in Massachusetts, it's an immigrant, historical immigrant city. Lowell, where Junior lives, it is an
Hmm.
immigrant city, and so this is relevant. This is
Yeah.
relevant, and certainly, it's also relevant and important for us to dig into the activism and identity and the numerous things and themes that you're addressing in your writing. So props to you, Julio.
Thank you.
Sigue pa'lante. Junior, si se puede. Yes, you can. And you're going to get that work done, man. You're going to get this assignment done. It's going to be excellent. And when it's done, we're going to share it with Julio.
Yeah, I can't wait to see it. Thank you so much for having me, Roberto Jr. It was great to meet you.
It was great.
And yeah, thank you so much. I'm excited to see what you work on.